When historians recount the expansion of Victorian London, they focus on the iron and steam, the rising chimneys, the 4 million residents, and the birth of the modern world. They speak of the Great Stink, the construction of the embankment, and the heroic engineering of Joseph Basil Gett. But the real story, the one that barely surfaced in the Royal Society's journals, the one that even today remains suppressed in the vaults of the Admiralty, began not in a laboratory, but in a hole. It started as a routine survey in the winter of 1874. A small team of engineers was instructed to map the heavy blue clay beneath the East End, stabilize the ground for a new railway extension, and determine if the Thames Basin could support a massive new pumping station near the Isle of Dogs. The goal was practical: drill, assess, and move on. But the moment the steam-powered borers broke through the primary layers of the London clay, something impossible happened. They didn't hit bedrock. They didn't hit the anticipated chalk. Instead, they broke through into a void that hadn't been touched since long before the Roman occupation. Beneath the city, deeper than any sewer line or subway tunnel, the crew found a series of vaulted galleries that didn't match the haphazard, brick-heavy construction of the British Empire. Their geometry was perfect. Their depth was terrifying. And the materials didn't resemble anything in the industrial catalogs of the 19th century. This discovery wasn't mentioned in the newspapers celebrating London's progress, but in the private ledgers of the project's lead engineer, a specific phrase appears repeatedly: non-terrestrial precision, unnatural thermal signature, origin unknown. The official story would later dismiss this as unstable geological pockets or abandoned Roman drainage. Nothing unusual, the public was told. But the sketches made by the surveyors, the ones drawn by gaslight while London slept above them, show something else. They show workers standing beside conduits made of a dark, vitrified substance far harder than granite. They show tunnel segments fused together so seamlessly that no mortar was used. Channel systems carved into the earth that bore no resemblance to modern plumbing, but something more deliberate, more sophisticated, and infinitely more dangerous. As the laborers pushed further into the breach, the atmospheric pressure changed. The air was dry, filtered, and carried a faint metallic tang that made the men's skin itch. They had moved past the recognizable strata of London, past the Victorian brick, past the medieval rubble, past the Roman timber piles. They had entered a zone that, according to every geological chart of the British Isles, should not have existed. What they found were the strata. This wasn't a single room or a simple tunnel. It was a vertical hierarchy of engineering. The walls were not made of individual stones, but appeared to be cast or molded from a single, continuous material. In the flickering light of their lanterns, the workers saw surfaces that were matte black, absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. Even more disturbing was the temperature. Despite being nearly 80 feet below the surface, the air was warm, not the damp heat of the earth, but a regulated, consistent warmth that suggested the infrastructure was still, in some capacity, functioning. The recovery photographs of the time, grainy, long-exposure plates, capture the scale of this anomaly. In one particularly haunting image, a foreman is seen holding a standard-issue surveyor's rod against a curved wall. The rod shows the wall to be a perfect arc, a mathematical ideal that no Victorian mason could have achieved in a subterranean environment with such consistency. There were no tool marks, no evidence of chisels, hammers, or saws. It was as if the earth itself had been hollowed out by a force that left the surrounding clay undisturbed, but replaced the void with a substance that defied analysis. At first, the Royal Society tried to categorize the find in the simplest way possible. They sent down archaeologists who suggested it was a prehistoric volcanic vent, or perhaps a forgotten medieval fortification built during the chaotic years of the anarchy. But as the maps expanded and the surveyors pushed deeper, the contradictions multiplied. The fortification theory fell apart when they realized the structures were built to withstand internal pressure, not external attack. Why were certain subterranean chambers lined with copper-rich alloys that carried a residual electrical charge, a charge that caused the workers' compasses to spin wildly and their hair to stand on end? Why were stone blocks shaped with microscopic uniformity, as if manufactured by a machine that didn't exist in 1874? London in the late 19th century was the undisputed center of the world, the pinnacle of the Industrial Revolution. Yet this network beneath the docks appeared designed for a city vastly more advanced, or perhaps a purpose that had nothing to do with human habitation. The recovery crews quietly acknowledged among themselves that the scale and precision didn't align with any known human records. They weren't using terms like lost technology or ancient aliens, but they were recognizing something equally disturbing. Someone, or something, had experimented beneath this ground before. This wasn't for storage or smuggling. This was infrastructure for power. As the evidence grew, so did the secrecy. By 1875, the Royal Society's involvement was quietly terminated, replaced by a specialized committee under the direct oversight of the Admiral and the Home Office. Reports became shorter, descriptions became vague. Scientific papers that had been slated for publication were suddenly redacted, citing national security concerns regarding the stability of the London docks. And then, the photographs stopped. The makeshift dark rooms that had been set up near the excavation site were dismantled. The workers were reassigned to projects in the furthest reaches of the empire: India, Australia, the Caribbean. The sites themselves were sealed. In late 1876, several of the largest excavation pits were accidentally flooded, backfilled with thousands of tons of concrete, and the most sensitive sections were returned to the dark. Only fragments of this period survive today. A few private journals, a handful of smuggled sketches, and the subdued accounts of elderly archivists who examined the gray files before they were purged in the 1950s. But even from what endures, a pattern is visible. The Victorian government didn't just find a ruin, they found a threat. They found a history that contradicted the narrative of British exceptionalism. If London, the greatest city on earth, was merely a crust sitting on top of a superior civilization's discarded machinery, the social order of the 19th century would have collapsed. The most jarring anomaly, and the one that truly troubled the lead engineers, was the alignment of the structures. In archaeology, layers of history are usually messy. One generation builds a cellar at one angle, the next century, a new street is laid at another. But beneath London, this logic failed. Every layer, the Victorian foundations, the medieval vaults, the Roman remnants, and the unknown strata below, maintained the same exact directional bearing. They were all aligned to a north that wasn't quite true north, but shifted by exactly 3.5 degrees. Different builders, separated by thousands of years, do not construct in flawless alignment with civilizations they didn't know existed. Yet beneath the Thames, they did. Chambers from the 1800s were positioned precisely above chambers from the 500s. Structural walls in the Victorian pumping station followed the exact trajectory of vitrified walls 60 feet below them. It was as if every group that ever built on the Thames was subconsciously following an original, invisible master plan, a blueprint that no longer appears in any historical documentation, but is etched into the very bedrock of the city. As the laborers dug deeper into the strata that the ministry called the primary foundation, the engineering became even more inexplicable. They found stonework that resembled nothing in history, massive slabs, some weighing upwards of 40 tons, with connections so tight that even today, civil engineers who examine the archival photographs are left in a state of disbelief. Certain chambers looked almost excessive in their design. There were vaulted spaces with perfect parabolic curves, executed with an accuracy that exceeded the capacity of any tool available in the 1870s. These weren't just rooms, they were resonators. The acoustics in these spaces were so precise that a whisper at one end could be heard with crystal clarity 200 feet away at the other, while the sound of a sledgehammer striking the wall was completely absorbed, producing no echo. And then arrived the finding that confused even the most traditional members of the engineering team: sophisticated hydraulic systems. They found channel systems with precision grating that moved water, or some other fluid, at high velocities without the need for pumps. They found drainage mechanisms with pressure-rated construction that suggested they were designed to handle liquids far denser than water. There exists no record of London possessing such advanced hydraulic engineering in the 19th century. No charts, no patents, no mention of the complex water systems below these particular locations. Recovery images captured in late 1874 demonstrate this unmistakably. In one photo, a group of laborers is positioned beside a conduit carved into the dark stone. The conduit is so smooth it looks like glass. The men, with their soot-stained faces and primitive iron tools, appear crude, almost like cavemen, in comparison to the refined technology they are standing next to. The gradients and connections in these channels mirror modern or even future infrastructure. They utilized a variable flow design that Victorian science hadn't yet conceptualized. But the most troubling detail was not the channels themselves, but where they led. They didn't lead to the Thames, they led down. They descended at a steep angle into the deepest parts of the basin, suggesting that whatever this infrastructure was, its primary function was located even deeper than the engineers dared to go. What didn't surface in the archives? The silence regarding these findings is perhaps the most damning evidence of their importance. Authorized reports composed in the decade following the recovery scarcely reference these characteristics. Certain illustrations in the National Archives exclude the deepest passages altogether, showing only the safe Victorian layers. Particular layers of infrastructure are condensed with indefinite terminology like earlier foundations or natural geological formations, even though the surviving photographs prove they were far more intricate. The silence is difficult to overlook. If these lower strata genuinely belonged to recognized historical periods, Roman, Celtic, or otherwise, why weren't they portrayed in detail? Why weren't the exceptional construction methods recorded thoroughly for the benefit of British industry? Why were the photographs dispersed across private maritime repositories instead of compiled into a single federal document? Even the surfaces of the stones presented a concern. The edges were too precise, the channels too uniform. The marks left behind weren't the jagged scars of a pickaxe. They were the smooth, melted ridges of something that looked like precision thermal cutting. Work that, based on the conventional chronology of human history, did not exist in the era these passages were presumably constructed. What the recovery crews revealed were structures that didn't correspond to British colonial construction, didn't correspond to Roman settlement patterns, and didn't even correspond to one another in conventional terms. Instead, they constituted a peculiar engineering vocabulary. This vocabulary appeared to originate from multiple periods, yet somehow remained cohesive, oriented, and impossibly exact. 1. Geometrically perfect chambers. The initial surprise of the engineers arrived with the chambers themselves. These weren't primitive storage cellars or confined cave networks. They were geometrically precise spaces, chambers shaped with exact proportions of the golden ratio. Arches preserved their curves impeccably under the weight of millions of tons of earth. Certain chambers were sealed entirely with a substance the workers called the seal, a translucent resin-like material that was impervious to their drills. Once breached by explosives, these chambers disclosed interiors that appeared undisturbed for eons. 2. Massive circular stone structures. Then there were the massive circular structures that still confound researchers who study the leaked sketches today. Formally, the ministry identified them as old cisterns or storage wells, but nothing about them corresponded to characteristic Victorian engineering. These were too balanced, too deep, and too flawlessly circular. Some were broad enough for 20 men to stand inside. Others contained internal features, grooves, teeth, and metallic inserts that suggested they were part of a massive mechanical system. Laborers characterized them in personal correspondence as the great wheels, not wells. They were constructions with a specific, perhaps kinetic function, though no one in the 1870s could specify what that function could have been. 3. Anomalous load-bearing design. Another peculiarity emerged in the support systems. These were not merely basic foundations. Many were designed with a load-bearing capacity that made no architectural sense for the modest merchant buildings and docks that had stood above them. The math didn't add up. Why build a foundation capable of supporting a skyscraper 1,000 feet tall when you are only building a 3-story warehouse? It generated an unsettling possibility. The City of London may not merely rest on the ground, it may rest on a pre-existing skeleton, an infrastructure whose true dimensions were never documented, never taught, and never clarified in the authorized history of the world. The further the laborers excavated, the more peculiar the discoveries became. Stone blocks emerged with completely straight boundaries, but inside the stone, the workers found something that shouldn't be there: metal. Not just iron nails or copper coins, but complex components fused into the heart of the rock. Certain fragments appeared oxidized in patterns that suggested they had been subjected to extreme heat. Heat so intense it had liquefied the surrounding stone, yet they were located in strata that presumably predated the Bronze Age. The authorized explanation provided subsequently was ship debris or colonial metal fittings that had migrated through the soil, but that does not account for why the metal emerges inside the stones in organized geometric patterns. This variety of result demands temperatures far exceeding typical forge work. It demands a level of metallurgy that the Victorian era was only beginning to dream of. In one account, a worker describes finding a silver-like thread that ran through 100 feet of solid stone without a single break. When he touched it, he claimed it felt thrumming, as if a distant engine were still vibrating through the wire. The organized underground network. Shortly following these findings, something peculiar started occurring at the excavation sites. The atmosphere changed from one of scientific discovery to one of military occupation. Chambers were resealed within hours of being opened. Passages were backfilled with a haste that suggested panic. Certain of this was formally designated as structural safety matters, necessary to stabilize the devastated waterfront. But the choices about which chambers to reseal first generated subdued questions among the witnesses. Why were the most ancient, pristine, and structurally flawless chambers the ones closed immediately? Why were the most unstable, crumbling areas left open for the public to see? The passages that were obstructed were invariably the ones that contested the authorized chronology the most. The flawlessly carved structures, the sophisticated water management systems, the unusual metal inclusions, all were returned to the earth. These passages were the most enigmatic discovery of all. They weren't haphazard tunnels. They were components of a systematic configuration, a network of corridors that appeared less like storage and more like a nervous system for the earth. Oriented, calculated, and organized, they appeared to connect to a substantially larger subterranean system, one that stretched below the entire Thames Valley long before any human settlement we recognize ever occupied the surface. When you examine the concluding months of the 1876 recovery operations, something becomes impossible to disregard. The initiatives didn't conclude. They were halted, not finalized, not terminated, but halted by executive order. The further the recovery crews proceeded, the more the character of their documentation transformed. Initial entries were assured, almost procedural, filled with the Victorian confidence of conquering the earth. But by the conclusion, the language becomes guarded, indefinite, and oddly incomplete. It's as if a new authority had stepped in, someone who understood that what was being revealed wasn't a treasure, but a fundamental error in our understanding of time. The final chambers. And this is where the ultimate mystery commences. Because the final chambers they accessed beneath the East End weren't typical. They weren't even classifiable. According to the few surviving accounts, the stonework abruptly transformed from ancient to inexplicable. The walls became translucent. The floors were perfectly level to within 1/1000th of an inch. One account from a junior engineer mentions a room that was filled with a light that had no source. He described a space where the air felt thick like water, and where the sounds of the city above, the horses, the steam whistles, the shouting, were replaced by a low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate in his very bones. And then the order came, the reburial. It wasn't a gradual process. It was a frantic effort to hide the evidence. Thousands of tons of concrete were poured into the shafts. The maps were confiscated. The photographs were burned or moved to deep storage. The official explanation remained geological volatility. But if it was solely about safety, why go to such lengths to erase the memory of the site? It doesn't make logic unless those lower strata posed a different variety of danger. Not a physical danger, but a historical one. The unanswered questions. Imagine what it would signify if a modern harbor city like London, or Halifax, or New York, or Tokyo, were constructed on top of something far more ancient, something massive, and something we didn't construct. Imagine if the foundations of our world weren't natural developments, but intentional attempts by subsequent peoples to conceal or repurpose what preceded them. Perhaps that is why the 1874 findings were quietly reinterred, not to safeguard the locations, but to safeguard the narrative. Because if the foundations below our cities genuinely display construction methods beyond our capacity, the complete accepted narrative of human history starts to crumble. The remaining sketches and fragmented reports convey their own narrative. They tell of infrastructure too consistent for its presumed age. They tell of a civilization that understood the earth in ways we are only beginning to grasp. These aren't the varieties of findings historians prefer to clarify. They are the varieties they prefer not to discuss at all. And that brings us to the ultimate question. Why was the deepest evidence, the earliest construction, the most sophisticated infrastructure sealed away again? When you step back, the configuration becomes apparent. The flawless stonework was interred. The peculiar circular structures were interred. The inexplicable passages were interred. The sophisticated water systems were interred. The embedded metal components were interred. And even portions of the photographic documentation vanished, almost as though the recovery had inadvertently disclosed a chapter of history that wasn't meant to emerge. A chapter more ancient than the Romans, more ancient than the Celts, more ancient than the narrative we were provided in our school books. For one brief instant in 1874, the expansion of London opened the ground sufficiently to reveal it. But rather than examining it, they closed it again. They sealed it, backfilled it, and forgot it. Or feigned to. Because if London stands on top of structures erected by a civilization we no longer recognize, then the genuine question is not what was revealed in the 19th century. It's what else remains beneath the great cities of the world. What other ports, what other waterfronts, what other capitals were quietly reinterred long before cameras existed? The 1874 London excavation wasn't merely a construction project. It was a glimpse, a brief, inadvertent glimpse into a version of history we were never intended to witness. And today, as we build even higher and dig even deeper, we have to wonder, how long can the concrete hold the secret? How long before the foundation decides to wake up?